Immigrant, the Newburyport Literary Festival. My name is Jennifer Entwistle, and I am the co-director of the festival. This is our 17th year of bringing authors and readers together and our third year as a virtual event. Now it is my honor to introduce our moderator today, Chris Koliander. She is a writer and editor living in Vermont. A home cook for many years, she authored the nationally recognized food blog, My Vermont Kitchen, introducing a new recipe to readers every week. She's a regular festival moderator and is also moderated at the Boston Book Festival. Welcome, Chris. I will turn it over to you.
Thank you. All right. Thank you. I seem to be the resident food moderator at this event. So every spring I get a call that another book is up. And so I get to spend my springs reading a book and then talking to fantastic authors like today's author. Today it is Mayukh Sen, who is the author of the book that we're talking about today, Tastemakers, 7 Immigrant Women Who Revolutionized Food in America. Mayukh has won a James Beard Award. For anyone who doesn't know what that is the top food writing award in the United States. An IACP Award, which is the International Association of Culinary Professionals, for his food writing. And his work has appeared in the Best American Food Writing 2019 and 2021 editions. He has written for the New York Times, Food 52, Washington Post, The New Yorker, The Atlantic, among other publications. And he teaches at Columbia University's creative writing program. So welcome. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. And thank you for having me as well, especially on Independent Bookstore Day. So
that's right. Yes. So everyone go out and buy this fantastic book. So you have told me that you were an accidental food writer. You kind of fell upon that, and you won awards for it. So I was halfway through the introduction and I had 4 questions already. So I'm going to talk very fast today so we can get as much in our 45 minutes and leave time for questions for everybody. So this accidental career that you got into. So how did this book come to be?
Yeah, totally. I'm very much an accidental food writer, like you say. So I had grown up wanting to be a film critic. And so I began work after I graduated from college in 2014 as a freelance writer covering topics like film, television, music, basically every aspect of the culture except food, right? And around that time, after a year and a half or so, in 2016, I get this offer to be staff writer at a site called Food 52. And the reason why they were interested in hiring me is because they wanted someone to write about culture more broadly through the lens of food. And I thought, that's interesting. You know, I never thought about food and writing about food, rather, in a professional sense, just because it felt like a domain that was so off limits for me as someone who did not belong to the dominant culture. You know, I'm a queer person of color, a child of immigrants. I just think that the way that I thought about food just felt so different from my conception of a food writer back then. But anyway, I took the job and I felt kind of alone in those first few months. You know, my colleagues in my workplace were absolutely wonderful. They were all white women on the editorial team, and I was just writing from a different center of gravity than they were. You know, my taste memories look different from theirs. And so to kind of ease my loneliness, what I started to do was tell a lot of stories about figures in the food world who came from marginalized communities like myself. So oftentimes these were people of color, women of color specifically, queer people of color like myself, immigrants of color, all the permutations of people who belong to those different groups. And that was a kind of way of me understanding, how do you navigate a system that might not necessarily be designed to accommodate someone like you. And so in trying to tell those stories of figures, oftentimes ones who were deceased, I started amassing kind of this budding body of work of stories that attempted to recirculate the legacies of some of these folks who may not have the same name recognition as someone like Julia Childs. And a friend of mine looked at those stories and said, I wonder if there is a larger book project simmering within this, one that focuses on immigration and food. And it was 2017 at that point. I was 25 years old, and I'm like, I'm a small child. I definitely do not have the talent, the skill, the discipline to take on a book project right now. So I kind of put it in my back pocket. Fast forward a year later, when I'm, so much wiser at 26 years old, I decide to revisit that idea. And I had noticed over the course of that year, so many talking points along the lines of immigrants get the job done and immigrants feed America that were popping up in throughout food media from publications that I really respected. And I could see the sincere good intentions behind those talking points, yet to me, they felt a touch patronizing in the sense that, they seem to inadvertently reinforce this notion that the value of immigrant lives in America must be measured based on whatever they can provide to a privileged consumer. And so I felt as though the most logical way for me within my limited skill set as a storyteller to push back against the sorts of attitudes was to write a group biography that stitched stories together of immigrant women who worked in the food industry. And what I want to do in telling these stories is really honor their creative impulses and really understand what their intentions were as artists who are working in food. And so that is where this book began. So I sold it in late 2018, and then, fast forward a few years later, and then it came out.
Right. So you said that you had a very wide net. So how did you take that wide net of all these immigrant cooks and then pare it down to get to the 7?
It was so tough. And I should preface this by saying that the 7 women who were in my proposal, which I sold in late 2018, are not the same 7 women who, appeared in the final version of this book. There are some common names, but otherwise I had to kind of leave a few on the cutting room floor, so to speak, which was tough. So I began by searching the term the Julia child of, actually. And so for those unfamiliar with this sort of trope, many women throughout culinary history, both within America and globally, have been called the Julia child of their respective countries of origin or regions to which they belonged. For example, the great Southern chef Edna Lewis was often patronizingly called, the Julia child of Southern cooking, or Julia child of the South. And searching that term surfaced so many names, some of whom were very familiar to me, others of figures whom I had not heard of before. And I felt as though, they really deserve to have their stories told on their own terms. And so that is how I kind of, part of how I got this sort of working list of potential figures I could write about, right? And some of those names ended up in my proposal. But then when it got to the actual writing, I realized that, so many of these women whom I wanted to write about, are no longer with us. And as a result, I can't call them up and say, hey, I'd love to talk to you about your career, as a journalist profiling a living subject would. And as a result, I had to rely upon whatever materials they had left behind that presented them speaking in their own voices, because I really wanted to understand how these women wanted to be perceived within the public eye, before then analyzing, how their legacy shook out, whatnot. And as a result of that, I had to really rely upon women who had left behind memoirs or cookbooks with autobiographical passages, or had given extensive interviews to the press that allowed me to understand, how they carried themselves throughout the world. And it's a shame, because I became aware of just how biased the archives are, and the limitation of the archives in that sense. They skew towards power. A lot of these women, in my book, are women who could afford to record their stories at all in the form of memoirs, for example. And what I needed to do as a writer, as someone who was positioning himself as an historian in this book, was to be open with my readers about those limitations. So that is just one way in which the book sort of changed, and the collection of these, 7 figures really changed. But it forced me to be more diligent about my overall thesis regarding who gets written into history and who gets left out.
Right. And one of the questions I had when I was reading it was that you are a man and you're writing about women. And you actually addressed that question in your introduction. It was like, why am I writing this? So talk about that inclusion, but also like, were you maybe thinking that yourself
Of course,
as you
yeah.
were writing it?
I was thinking about it constantly, and I've been thinking about it, so often throughout my career as a food writer, which has been just over 5 years now. Why is it that I gravitate towards the stories of female identifying figures? And I didn't really quite know how to articulate it when I went into this project. I wanted to be very clear about the fact that, I possess certain privileges as someone who presents as a man to this world in telling these stories, and that, there are limitations to my hand as a result. And I don't want to overstep any boundaries or lean on certain tropes about men writing about women and whatnot. But over the course of writing this book, I came to articulate something that I had struggled to in the past, which is that, as a queer person, I have a complex relationship to gender and gender expression that my appearance, my facial hair and everything does not necessarily reflect or even let on. And, who I am inside, how I feel inside, the stories I relate to inside of me, it doesn't necessarily show itself in the way that I present myself to the world, right? And as a result, I came to understand that I have throughout my entire life just, felt a sort of kinship with the stories of women more than male presenting figures. And that is a kind of storytelling that I wanted to honor in this book, and so that was kind of a balance that I need to strike, and saying, well, I do have my reasons for writing this book. It's because I'm working through my own struggles, so to speak. That sounds like too dramatic a word, but certain realizations about myself and who I am in this world, in writing this book. But there will still be limits to my hand. So I had to be very clear about that.
Well, you did a great job. So I wanted to start off with this question, and I wasn't sure where to put it in our conversation today. So I just thought that we would just talk about the elephant in the room. And the elephant's name is Julia, and that is Julia Child, who is having her umpteenth renaissance with the HBO Max series, Julia. She was a co-author of Mastering the Art of French Cooking. She was one of the first women to have a cooking show on TV, and was known as the French chef. Although she was not French, she lived in France, but she grew up in California. And you included in the middle of the book, in the middle of these stories, an interlude that you called it on her, which I thought was really, she fits into almost every single one of these women's stories, which was interesting. So talk about the inclusion of the interlude on her.
Yeah. First of all, I appreciate you saying that she was a co-author on Mastering the Art of French Cooking.
That's true.
So many people might be predisposed to say that she was the sole author, even though there were two French women, Simone Beck and Louisette Berthold, who co-authored that with her. So thank you for saying that. So in my initial draft of this book that I turned in late 2019, Julia Child did not have a shorter chapter interlude, as I call it, devoted to her. Yet my wonderful editor at Norton, Melanie Tortoroli, looked at that first draft of mine and said, it's so fascinating that Julia Child is this figure who pops up in so many chapters. She is a supporting character in some, but her ghost sort of hovers over some of the later chapters as well, because of that exact attitude that I was talking about earlier regarding so many of these women, throughout American culinary history, especially ones in my book being called the Julia Child of the respective countries of origin. And so she told me she suggested rather that I write an essay that looks at Julia Child's legacy from a different lens, because as you point out, her story has been told to death. And I did not want to tread familiar territory. And so what I really wanted to understand in writing that essay is, how it is that she, an American-born woman who came from what she called a WASPy family in Pasadena, California, became the face of French cooking in America, and whether she was aware of the privileges that allowed her to rise, to that level of prominence at all. And I didn't want to take away from her immense talent. You know, she was an incredibly gifted figure whom I respect and love deeply, you know. And so that is when I decided to write a shorter, I believe it's just over 3,000 words or so, or kind of hovering in that word count, essay on her, and the fact that, you know, she was very much aware of the fact that, you know, she belonged to a privileged population, and that allowed her to gain more easy entry into the food world. In spite, that is not to downplay the immense sexism that she faced, you know, during her rise to fame in the early 1960s. But I felt as though, you know, writing, you know, those 3,000 words on her would kind of unlock a more nuanced understanding of all the other women in this book. So that is kind of how I arrived at that.
I know, because I don't feel like we can talk about food in America without talking about her.
Absolutely
It
not.
just, she just fits in everywhere. But
Yeah.
let's talk about the real French chef in your book, and that is Madeleine Kamen. She was a cooking teacher. She ran restaurants, and she tended to focus on technique rather than precision, which Julia Child was known for, but that sometimes didn't register with her critics and readers. Talk a little bit about her.
Yeah, totally. So Madeleine Kamen kind of came onto the scene, so to speak, in the late 1960s, and that was when the food editor of the New York Times, Craig Claiborne, profiled her. And after that point in, I believe, 1968, you know, she got a cookbook deal, and that resulted in her first cookbook, 1971's The Making of a Cook. And that book, as you say, was very much technique driven. And many critics of the era, at least in my research, said that, you know, it was just too inaccessible and too dense to really register with wider audiences in the same way that Julia Child allowed her work to, especially because of her appearances on television. And Madeleine was in some ways a purist in that she did truly honor, you know, this belief that, you know, any cook, whether you're a home cook or in a restaurant, must master technique before then fiddling with that technique and, you know, discovering your own voice in the kitchen, so to speak. Yet, you know, that wasn't necessarily the popular stance to take, you know, in the early 1970s when she first began writing. And an added kind of complicating factor was that Madeleine Kamen herself was a very outspoken woman, and the very privileges that I was talking about in relation to Julia Child, she was someone, Madeleine Kamen was someone who's very outspoken about pointing those imbalances out. The fact that Julia Child, as this waspy woman from Pasadena, became the face of French cooking in America, in spite of the fact that there's so many French women in America, like Madeleine Kamen herself, who may have been, you know, more qualified to hold that sort of a position in the American mind. And so she, you know, Madeleine Kamen throughout her career, especially earlier on, was quite outspoken about her, let's say, misgivings about Julia Child's fame and her problems with Julia Child. And that did not necessarily earn her fans within the highest ranks of the American food establishment. And it was so upsetting, although unsurprising to me, to sift through so many articles that I found on Madeleine Kamen that were framing her in such misogynistic terms, you know, always talking about how difficult she was and abrasive and arrogant and all these other descriptors that so many of us now recognize as sexist dog whistles. She had to fight against so many of those prejudices just so her talent could have a wider stage, and it's incredibly unfair.
Yes, when I was reading it, and I was taking notes as I was reading, and I wrote large capital letters, sexism and feminism. And that affected all these women, but I felt her story more than anyone else, she was affected by that. And I felt like she had to go above and beyond to get to where she was.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I just felt like she really fought against a lot.
Yeah, she truly did. And, you know, like you kind of point out, I believe, She wore so many hats throughout her career. She was a restaurant chef. She authored many cookbooks. She also had a television career on PBS. Some, members of the audience might recall that she had a show called Madeline Cooks from 1986 to 1991 that was broadcast on public television. Yet, in spite of her many, many achievements, the press so often reduced her to this sort of agitator, irritant, this crotch on the side. When in fact, she had so much more to offer. So.
Well, hopefully people will be rediscovering her now, because she does have tons of cookbooks out. So the cook who brought the phrase stir fry to our world was Chow Yang Bue. Did I pronounce that right? Her book, How to Cook and Eat in Chinese, was published in 1945, and it was described as the first systematically thorough book on Chinese cooking. There were other Chinese cookbooks out at the time, but what was it about hers that stood out?
Yeah, so that book came out in 1945. So, just around the time that World War II ended. And she had the writer Pearl S. Buck as a huge champion of her cookbook. But what was truly groundbreaking about Bue's 1945 cookbook is the fact that she showed her American readers that there was more to Chinese cooking than what one could find in a nominally Chinese restaurant in America at the time. So she exposed the American reader to Chinese cooking that was not just Cantonese. And she also kind of dispelled this notion that all Chinese food is just chop suey, which itself is a dish that has a very tangled history. And, that combined with the fact that she introduced terms like stir fry, for example, to American audiences, made her in many ways, a trailblazer of her time. And as I write in the book, I do think that she really set the stage for so many Chinese immigrant cookbook authors, especially women in America, to write cookbooks that would bring even more nuance to American readers' understanding of Chinese cooking. Yet, what I find so upsetting is that, Bue's name has been sort of buried, beneath the rubble of history, and I think the most damning evidence of that is that, when she died in the early 1980s, she did not receive a New York Times obituary of her own, yet her husband, the famed linguist Chow Yan-ren, he did, and he died a year later, and she is reduced to just a single line in that obituary. His wife died the previous year. And, what a way to just overwrite a woman's legacy.
Right. All of the women had really fascinating stories, but the one that may have stood out the most for me was Elena Zelayeta from Mexico. She was here with her family, vacationing in San Francisco when the Mexican Revolution happened, and they were stuck here as exiles. And so she and her family had to make a living, and she learned how to cook later in life, but she also became blind at the age of 36 and learned how to cook. Talk a little bit about her story.
Yeah,
I just found it fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely. Talk about someone who endured immense hardship. So Elena Zelayeta, like Chris said, found herself stranded in, California's Bay Area in the early 20th century. And, she and her family decided to stay because of the events of the Mexican Revolution. As Elena grew older, she realized that she had a real aptitude for cooking. And, as kind of her career progressed, she went beyond the sort of repertoire that was very familiar to her of just Mexican and Spanish, recipes. She started incorporating so many ingredients that one could find in California cuisine around her. She had to fight many battles throughout her career, and one of them was the fact that as an adult, she lost her sight, and shortly after that, she lost her husband as well. And so it was through these twin tragedies that she really had to, relearn and summon once again the will to cook as she had prior to losing her sight. And she did so many times over, after.
That was amazing.
She, learned to rely upon, her existing senses, to smell, to touch, to taste, of course. And through that, she was able to find her footing in the kitchen once again. And after that, she began writing cookbooks starting in the mid 1940s. Up until the late 1960s, shortly before her death in the early 1970s. And, what I find so fascinating is that she did not confine herself, as I said earlier, excuse me, to just Mexican and Spanish recipes. She truly embraced the fact that, as an immigrant, she would incorporate Japanese ingredients and Italian ingredients and others one could find in, the Bay Area at the time. And so she didn't just position herself as an authority on Mexican cooking, which I think is a sort of expectation that a lot of these women kind of had to, grapple with. It's like, do I kind of let the public pigeonhole me as a sort of ambassador for the cuisine or cuisines of my origin country? And, it does that really gel with my own creative impulses? And, in Elena's case, she was content to have her food reflect who she was as a Mexican immigrant woman in America.
Mm. Marcella Hazan is probably the name that most people know. She was Italian. She moved here with her husband, Victor. Victor is the one who actually translated her cookbooks because she moved here and she didn't know English. But she really was a cooking teacher, despite and also having her cookbooks. But you had said that her fall into food may have been an instance of being in the right place at the right time. So talk a little bit about her.
Yeah, totally. And I don't want the insinuation there to be that Marcella just lucked out, because she is so talented and her talent is not a matter of dispute, but what really fascinated me is the fact that, her chapter in the book comes right after the chapter on Madeleine Camin. And as I was saying just a few minutes ago, Madeleine Camin had she had to fight against all these perceptions that she was too difficult and arrogant and whatnot. And I think that Marcella also faced kind of similar criticisms, one could call them. I think that's too charitable word for, what was going on there. Yet that didn't necessarily deter her from becoming a household name. You're exactly right that, avid home cooks throughout America might know her name more than the names of anyone else in this book. And I was fascinated by the fact that happened, because I became all too aware in writing this book of just the inherent misogyny of the food world and how it can really stifle the creative voices of women who really have something to say. Yet that didn't seem to happen with Marcella Hazan. And I do think that a lot of that has to do with the fact that prior to her writing her first cookbook in the early 1970s, there hadn't been an Italian cookbook author who really reached the American masses in the way that she was able to. Of course, there had been Italian cookbooks prior to that point, yet, none of them had really taken off in the way that the classic Italian cookbook was able to in the early 1970s. And, I think that the zeitgeist was very much in her favor in that regard. And I think that is part of why her name endures, in addition to her many, many indisputable gifts as a cook and writer.
Yeah, she had a lot more popularity than it, like Bloomingdale's had a Marcella Hazan Italian kitchen little section in their store, and she had celebrities going to her cooking school. And so she had a little bit more popularity than everyone else.
Yeah.
So I think you're right about right place at the right. I don't know. How do things catch on? But okay, Julie Sani. We're like running out of time. Julie Sani. She traveled the world as a dancer before graduating with a master's in urban planning, which she used for many years until she started her own cooking school. She was from India. So talk about America's obsession with India in the 1970s when she began.
Yeah, so Julie Sani, after growing up in India and having this career as a dancer, as you say, she went on to pursue architecture in school and then as a career. And that is why she moved to America in 1968. It was to go to grad school at Columbia. And it was a time during which America, at least in her recollection, and she is one of two subjects in this book who is still alive. So I was able to hear all this firsthand, her recollections of this period in American history. It was a time during which America was very much obsessed with all things India, or at least had an infatuation that hadn't matched any, prior to that point. The Beatles and their association with musician Ravi Shankar, for example, was a sign of the perceived hipness, let's say, of Indian culture to many Americans. Yet, when it came to food, Julie seemed to find that so many Americans could only understand Indian cooking through the prism of curry. And she was not necessarily denying the existence of curry, but she wanted to show Americans around her that there was far more to Indian cooking than just this kind of glop of spiced gravy. And that is partially why she began her cooking school in the early 1970s out of her Brooklyn apartment. It's because she wanted the people around her, the city around her, to understand that there are entire galaxies of recipes that exist within her home country, and she knew some of them, and she was able to scale that school to such a degree that she left her career as an urban planner, and she devoted herself entirely to food. And what I found so remarkable about Julie's story is that she was a woman of so many faces. She was a cookbook author. She was a cooking teacher. She was also reportedly the first Indian woman to hold the post of executive chef at a New York restaurant. And yet, there are so many people, including food writers in my generation, who do not necessarily honor or celebrate her accomplishments enough. I was so dismayed to see, how casually her legacy was overwritten in an obituary for the late great chef Lloyd Cardoz, who was also born in India and was a man of incredible talent, who deserves celebration. Yet, I remember reading that obituary and seeing him positioned as, the man who brought, India to fine dining in America. And I was just thinking, well, Julie did that before, and there's so many others, they blazed that trail for him as well. And why not just honor that labor without taking away from Floyd Cardoz's legacy? And I was trying to correct for that as much as possible in this book.
So let's talk about our Iranian cook. All right, I'm going to try and say her name. Najmieh.
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 Yeah, very close.
Batmanglij. Batmanglij. Okay, so she was an Iranian refugee in the 1980s who fled because of the Iranian Revolution. And she ended up in France and ended up writing an Iranian cookbook in French, which is amazing. But then when she and her family came to the United States, it was the late 70s, early 80s. Iran wasn't looked particularly favorably upon in our views because of the hostages and everything. And so she and her husband set up their own publishing company, and she has self-published all these cookbooks, and she is the foremost name in Iranian cooking. I think it's amazing. So talk a little bit about her.
Yeah, I was so amazed by her fortitude because, as you say, she came to America in the early 1980s, and it was a time during which, at least in her recollection, it was in many ways so tough to exist as an Iranian person in public and celebrate your culture. So she had that French language cookbook to her name by the time she came to America in 1983. And, she knew at that point that she wanted to write an English language cookbook that was even more ambitious. And so when she sent out query letters to major American publishers, she found herself being met with either polite rejection or total silence. And the kind of unspoken response there, or implication rather, was that publishing an Iranian cookbook would be anathema to most major American publishers, and they couldn't have that happen. It was too great a financial risk. And instead of being too dismayed by that sort of prejudice that was wired into the market at that point, what Najmieh did, along with her husband Mohammed, was she decided, you know what, we're going to pool our resources. We're going to get as much money as we can on our own to start our own publishing house, and we're going to make this dream a reality. And that resulted in her first English language cookbook, Food of Life, which was published in the mid 1980s and is now widely regarded as the English language opus on Iranian food in America. And she's published many more, and she is now considered by so many to be the grande dame of Iranian cooking, certainly in America. Yet throughout her career, she has forged this independent path. And what I found so inspiring, although upsetting, about her career is that she had to circumvent the limited imagination, let's say, of the American food media to make her voice heard. And she did that. And there's so many other Iranian origin authors who follow in her footsteps. Yet, there was not room for her in this industry. And that is a real shame. And she was able to realize her ambitions in spite of that. So.
Okay, so I didn't talk fast enough, and we have 3 questions for the audience.
Okay.
All right. So Katz says, I'm assuming that you're not only an accomplished food writer, but also a dab hand in the kitchen.
Okay.
As we can see your fridge, I'd love to have a peek inside and hear what you're cooking tonight.
Oh man, I don't know if I can offer a peek inside without, exposing you to any grime. But so I'm going to respectfully decline to do that, if that's okay, Kat. But I will say, I should have mentioned this at the top of my conversation. Which is that when I was hired at Food 52, I was someone who was neither an avid home cook nor a restaurant enthusiast. And I must admit, 5.5 years later, that is very much still the case. I'm not burning my dinner 3 weeks or three nights a week anymore. Now it's maybe 1 night a week, let's say, so I've gotten a bit more able in the kitchen, but I am by no means Ina Garten or Emerald Lagasse in the kitchen. And I think that's fine. I'm writing about, people who make food rather than food itself as an object. But in terms of what I will make tonight, I think I'm just going to make a turkey burger, keep it simple, my little Saturday night treat. So I'm sorry for that disappointing and very revealing answer.
Ryan asks, many of the women in the book were alive before the internet. How do you think the internet and modern publishing changed opportunities for immigrant women today?
That's a wonderful question. Yeah, I definitely, and perhaps I'm being too optimistic here, but my observation, just based on what I've seen regarding who gets cookbook deals nowadays, is that, publishers are far more open to giving cookbook deals to people who belong to marginalized communities, like so many of these women did. And I think part of that has to do with the fact that, social media does make it a bit easier for one to establish, oneself without the aid of, being attached to a certain institution like Food 52 or the New York Times, for example. And, it's not smooth sailing exactly, but, I've seen, and I'm lucky to be in community with so many really wonderful food writers who forged that very independent path. And then, we're able to get cookbook deals that allow their talents to reach even wider audiences. So I do hope that trend continues. I hope that it's not just a sort of flavor of the moment that fizzles out. A lot remains to be seen. But right now, I will say that I, a cynic, am optimistic.
And this is a really good one. Casey asks, so many recipes are generationally passed down. My husband's is his grandmother's meatballs and gravy. Mine is my mom's cranberry sauce, and my dad's mac and cheese. What family recipes do you cherish the most?
Oh man, that is a really, really wonderful question. I would say 2. Okay, this might be a bit of an unorthodox answer, but I am Bengali American. So my family is from what is now the Indian state of West Bengal. And one of the signature dishes of the Bengal region in general is machir jhol, which is to indelicately translated, it's a fish curry, for lack of a better term. Yet I was born with the unfortunate, a very unfortunate allergy to fish. And as a result, I've never been able to taste this actual dish, yet it is one that was constantly around me, growing up, even though I just have to lock myself in my room to prevent, anaphylaxis or anything like that. But, I really cherish that because I know that cooking that recipe gives my mother so much pleasure. And I wish I could taste it. And, one day if I ever do have children, I hope that I can pass that recipe of hers along to them, and hopefully they will not be saddled with the same impediment that I've been saddled with. And the second is my late father's egg curry, or what is more beautifully known as a dimmer dalna in Bengali. My father died 5 years ago, and he did not cook often because I grew up in a patriarchal household in which my amazing mother was unfairly tasked with so much of the domestic labor. Yet, when he did deign to cook, he, that dimmer dalna was his specialty. And, I miss the taste of, food made by his hands, and I miss him so much. And I wonder if having that recipe would be a way to access him when I otherwise can't. So that is another one that I cherish. So I hope that answers your question.
Food is very much associated with memory and vice versa.
Absolutely.
Wouldn't you say?
Yeah, no, it totally is.
So we have like 3 minutes left. So I will talk about our the last cook in the book, and that's Norma Shirley, who was born in Jamaica. She was trained as a nurse, and she didn't even know how to cook until she came to the United States. And she learned how to cook by cooking in Master of the Art of French Cooking. It's everywhere. So she really changed. She came before the sort of renaissance of the Caribbean food movement. And although she wasn't able to get investing for a restaurant in New York, she went back to Jamaica, and she has several restaurants. But so talk a little bit about her.
Yeah, so Norma Shirley was a Black immigrant woman who was born and raised in Jamaica. And when she came to America, in the later half of the 20th century, she began really finding her voice in the kitchen after she learned how to boil water and other cooking basics. And she was particularly attracted to making French food with Jamaican flair, so she would spice some, dishes with pico pepper sauce, for example, and other staples of Jamaican cooking. And she wanted to, launch her own restaurant in New York in the early 1980s. That reflected her culinary sensibility after a few years of cooking that way at a restaurant in the Berkshires in Massachusetts. Yet she could not find access to investors or enough capital to make that dream a reality. And so what she did instead was she kind of followed a similar path to Najmi Bangladesh, which is that she decided, what? The American food industry does not have room for me. Fine. I'm just going to go back home and realize, my ambition's there instead, like in front of a willing audience. And so in the mid 1980s, she returned to her homeland, began all these restaurants that really, truly reflect her sensibility without filter. And it was only after that point that the American food media started paying attention to her and lavishing praise upon her very obvious talent. And I thought that was just such a damning indictment of where American food was in the early 1980s, in the sense that it didn't have room for talent like hers. And so she had to literally leave this country for America to realize, what they'd once had on their hands. So.
What would you say is a commonality? When I closed the book, I was like, these 7 women have so much in common. What would you say are some of the commonality that you found as you were doing the research and writing their pieces?
Yeah, I would say the most striking commonality, and I'm aware we have like 1 minute left, so
I know.
I'm trying to keep this quick. The one commonality that really struck me is that all these women began as home cooks, no matter where their careers took them, into restaurants, into writing cookbooks, onto television, like Madeline Kamen, for example. They began as home cooks, and they truly respected home cooking as an art form. I think that it is very tempting for many people in the general public to imagine restaurant chefs as the sole artists in the kitchen. Yet, they found these women, all 7 of them, saw inherent dignity in the art of home cooking, and their work really reflected that. And I found that so powerful and a feminist statement in its own right.
So everyone should cook dinner tonight,
Yes,
even if it's
me.
a turkey burger.
Yeah, exactly.
I have like so many more questions, and
I know.
I
I'm
for another
sorry.
45 minutes.
I know that when my face comes on, like the fun is over. It's like
we'll talk really fast.
Thank you so much. I mean, I am not a cook by any means, but these food panels are always my favorite ones. I love hearing all the food talk. This has been such a great discussion. I can tell the audience is having a great time. They're all chatting over there, giving us lots of suggestions of podcasts and books to read. So Mayukh, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure to meet you. Chris, thank you as always for being a fabulous moderator. And thank you to our audience for being such a great audience and for being here.
Thank you so much.
Thank
all
you.
of you for coming, and thank you, Chris. I appreciate it.
Bye-bye.